Dr. Adesogan received his bachelor's degree in 1988 in agriculture at the University of Ibadan in Nigeria, and his master's and PhD in animal nutrition at the University of Reading in the United Kingdom. He was an assistant professor of animal nutrition at the University of Wales, UK, from 1995 to 2001, and is currently a professor of animal nutrition and the director and principal investigator of the Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Livestock Systems. He's served on the editorial boards of the Journal of Animal Science and Animal, and chaired or co-chaired the committees of over 20 graduate students. He has authored or co-authored over 100 scientific peer-reviewed publications, received over $65 million in research grants, given over 100 international or national seminars in over 25 countries. His interests are in dairy cattle nutrition, particularly improving forage preservation and quality, as well as using animal source foods to improve human nutrition. He has received various awards, including the American Dairy Science Association Pioneer Forage Award and the 2019 Buffalt International Agriculture Award from the American Society of Animal Science. We're so glad to be able to have Dr. Adesogan here to talk to us this morning. And with that, sir, I'll turn the virtual floor over to you.
Thank you very much, Gail. And thank you, Gail, Barry. Really appreciate the organizers for extending this invitation to me. And I want to thank everybody else who has called in. I hope you're doing well and your families are all safe. This morning, I'm going to very briefly introduce silage shrink. I'll spend a little bit of time talking about how it occurs, where it occurs, when it occurs. And then I'll really spend the majority of my talk talking about how to reduce or minimize shrink. And I'll finish with a few take-home messages. So shrink is a loss in the mass of silage at feed out relative to how much you ensile. So it's really a significant waste. And those of us in academia use the term dry matter losses to refer to shrink. And I like this picture here because it really shows how much reduction occurred between when the silage was put up and then later on as time had passed. And you can see that on the sidewalls. And one of the biggest problems with shrink is that it's not usually visible. And so it's easy to ignore the fact that this significant loss of forage is taking place. So we want to look at how significant these losses are and what is causing them and what to do about them. So this graph here has dry matter losses on the left-hand side and different stages of silage fermentation, from direct ensiling when you put up the forage without curing, to when you cure, in-silo respiration, in-silo fermentation, and then the feed-out stage. And the white areas of the boxes show what happens when you have very good management. So if it's an ideal scenario, you really don't avoid dry matter losses completely, but you really minimize them. And then what happens in the light gray boxes, that's with medium to poor management. And so if you look at with field curing, respiration, harvesting, we'll talk a little bit more about that, there's a lot more opportunity for losses. So now you're adding about 11% of losses on top of the 4. And if you have rainfall and seepage, then you're adding another 5%. And these are just average numbers. So now you're over about 20% or approximately about 20% losses. Then if you add the losses in silo, so the fermentation losses, then you have significant losses up to 13% there in the silo. And if you don't have a good cover or you don't have any cover, then there are some losses there. But really, if you have no cover, the worst losses occur, the worst losses as far as not having a cover take place during the feed out stage. And so you can see just not having a cover at 13%. Again, I stress that this is probably just an average value. And again, you see there that the bad management or poor management have 18%. So you can have significant losses. And I think one of the biggest points to stress here is that at each stage, there are losses. And the level of management that is imposed will affect how much losses you have. This graph here summarizes the different types of fermentation pathways that take place once oxygen is excluded and the silo is sealed. So first of all, you have the homofermentative pathway in which glucose is fermented into lactic acid. That's the most efficient pathway, and you have very negligible losses. And that's what we try and do when we add the traditional homofermentative inoculants. Then you have the heterofermentative pathway, and this is what we push with inoculants like some of the heterofermentative inoculants. And in this case, you have your sugars, your glucose being fermented into lactic acid. The problem is that when you generate ethanol and carbon dioxide, you lose a lot of dry matter in the process. And so you can have up to 24. So you have a range of 5 to 24% losses there. And then you have these microorganisms on this at the bottom area here, which will either take the lactic acid formed in the earlier stage and convert it into butyric acid, where you have a very, very significant loss of both dry matter and energy. So this is what happens in a butyric silage, when it's really, really badly smelling, and you lose a lot of energy and dry matter losses. If yeast and molds take hold of the oxygen, ferment it into ethanol, then again, you lose a lot of dry matter losses, maybe not so much energy. And then if you also have enterobacteria that degrade protein and contribute to proteolysis, again, you have significant losses. So different pathways contribute to losses in different ways. Now, if we look at those different stages in silage fermentation, some of the losses are unavoidable, and then some of them are avoidable, or at least you can reduce them to a minimum threshold. So respiration losses occur when you harvest the forage and it's still in the field before you put it in the bunker. And plant enzymes will continue to break down different compounds. Microbes like bacteria will continue to use aerobic respiration to produce CO2. So you do have some losses. And then during the fermentation, you have some more. The thing is that these will take place regardless. Seepage or effluent losses can be prevented. If you harvest your forage, like your corn at about 35% dry matter, you get little or no seepage losses. Wilting losses will occur, but the question is how much losses will you have? And it depends on how long it takes for you to wilt your forage properly and how you do it. Secondary fermentation, so this is like the butyric fermentation I talked about. And with proper ensiling, with a rapid pH drop, maybe using inoculants, using the right maturity at harvest, and so on, you can avoid those. Heating or aerobic deterioration losses. Now, these can be very significant. So this 0 to 10 is just I think is an estimate under relatively good management. And so things like delayed sealing and not packing well and so on will contribute to this. And then the last stage here is feed out losses. And again, how you manage your feed out will affect the extent of these losses. So this just emphasizes that each stage of your silage production process, you can have losses. And it's important to manage each stage well. Okay, so what are the implications of these losses? First of all, you are throwing away a lot of silage that could be fed to animals. And intake is one of the biggest drivers of performance. So we're wasting silage, we're losing energy, losing nutrients, protein is being degraded, you can have heating, you can have spoilage, and all these will contribute to reduced intake and performance. And so the question is, how many of us really know how much our losses are costing us on our farms? If we think about the financial implications, so last year in the US, we made about 133 million tons of silage. And if a user cost of $50 a ton, so that's over $6.5 billion worth. Now, if the total losses of dry matter were 20%, that's over $1 billion. So silage dry matter losses are a significant problem to the industry. And if you have really bad management and you have 40% of losses, then you can have $2 billion. But on the individual farm, what does this mean? Well, if you paid $50 a ton for your forage and you had zero waste, then your money was well spent and it was $50 for the ton. But if you had 10% waste, then you still paid the $50 a ton, but you only got you got 10% less. And as you go up, as you have more spoilage, it means that the money you spend is for less and less quantity of forage. And so this is very important because it means that if we're not careful, we're spending money and literally throwing it down the toilet. So it's really important for us to think about these costs and to quantify our losses and try and think about the financial implications. So how do we measure these losses? First of all, you can weigh all the silage going into a bunker or a bag as you are packing, and then you can weigh it out at feed out or unloading. And the difference will give you an indication of the losses, and you can express that on a dry matter base. If that's not practical, you can take a burlap bags and you can bury them at strategic locations inside the bag. So you want to make sure you have some in the top layer, some around the sidewall areas, and then you'd also want to distribute them through the length of the bag or the bunker. And you may want to tie a bright red or bright green piece of string to the bag so that you can easily retrieve it. And again, by looking at the difference in weight before and after in silage, you can get an estimate of your dry matter content, of your dry matter losses, once you put it on a dry matter base. Then there's the indigestible marker method, which assumes that during the fermentation and so on, you don't lose ash, but you lose organic matter. And so there's a formula that can be used to calculate losses based on things like ash and other components that are not digested. So we need to be measuring our losses, and we need to be able to say, last year I had this percentage losses, but this year I've successfully reduced those losses. Now, when we think about how much loss we have, some areas of the silo are particularly important to bear in mind. First of all, with our bags, the outer layer, especially if you don't have sufficient plastic wrap around the bale, and then the sidewalls. The sidewalls, you don't have enough tractor traffic, wheel traffic, so the packing density is usually less, and you have that being much more susceptible to spoilage and to losses. Same thing with the top layer. I'll talk more about the top layer, but the top layer is also a significant area of dry matter loss. So let's visit a little bit about this top layer. If you look here, you can see this darkened top layer, and it doesn't look that thick. So you might think, well, yeah, it's just a little bit, I'll get rid of it. But usually what you see at the time of silo opening is probably a third of what was there at the time of sealing the silo. So there's shrinking has taken place, and you've lost a lot of volatile compounds, CO2, and so on and so forth. And so this is a fraction of what you started with. And the problem, in this case, you can see the color is darker. What happens is the protein gets heated up, gets combined with sugars, and in presence of heat, you have a Maillard reaction. So the protein gets denatured, it gets less digestible. So you lose dry matter. I'll use a lot of the digestibility of the forage in that portion. And this estimate here indicates that in a 4,000 square foot silo, you could be losing 40 tons. So it's a significant amount of loss. And this is some study from Kansas State. Keith Bolson, several years ago, took that top layer silage and just fed it at increasing amounts to some cattle. And what he found was a linear reduction in dry matter intake and a linear reduction in NDF digestibility. And we know that NDF digestibility and intake are the drivers of milk production. So guess what will happen if you are feeding some of that silage to the cows? It's going to reduce the performance. So it's very important for us to get rid of that top layer, but it's more important for us to prevent it from being thick, to minimize the thickness. And then another question is, how much heating do we have? And heating is very important because, again, with heating, you have denatured proteins, you have depleted energy. You can have mold growth, which further depletes nutrients and may cause production of mycotoxins that make the animals sick or reduce performance. So how much silage are we wasting? How much do we have to throw away and we think we're not feeding? Again, it's important to quantify. This is a picture Bill Mahana took some years ago with a thermal imaging camera. And what it really just shows is the areas that are most susceptible to heating. So the area near the sidewall here, you can see that the temperature, you see the color is red as opposed to green or yellow. So that just shows a really high temperature as a result of heating. Same thing with the top layer. So very, very high temperatures in the top layer. So those areas that are very prone to heating and dry matter losses would be your top layer and would also be your sidewall area. In addition, the whole face, you can see here in the middle, the face, the areas not quite at the bottom, the middle areas, the longer those stay exposed, the more heating you will have. So moving through that face rapidly is critical. So on this page now, having discussed the problem, here are some management strategies. There are 10 of them, which are important to make sure that we reduce our losses and we minimize them. And what I'm going to do is go through each of these relatively quickly. So to prevent field and harvest losses, the first thing is to make sure we're harvesting at the right maturity. If we're harvesting too early, then we can get seepage. If you're harvesting corn silage about 25, 26% dry matter, then seepage can be a problem. Obviously, the starch has not accumulated in the grain, your yields may be low. But if you're harvesting too late, then you have more porosity. And that porosity is because it's a reflection of air pockets that are in the silage mass. So your packing density is lower. In the field itself, you may have more disease problems like rust. But because of that lower packing and greater porosity, that silage is going to be more prone to heating. Then wilting is also important. So wilting, remember that once you cut the forage down, the longer you leave it in the field, the longer you provide an opportunity for respiration to continue. This is aerobic respiration, where the bacteria are taking oxygen and giving out carbon dioxide. So you're losing, you have losses taking place during this stage. And the width of your swath is very important. And so wide swathing here in this study with alfalfa reduced drying time by approximately a day. This is getting the alfalfa to a dry matter of 45%. So a whole day was saved, and this increased milk per ton by up to 20%. So wide swathing is important. It's an important strategy to reduce the losses. And then the type of conditioner you use is also important, whether you're using a flail or a roller. And so if you look at this graph at the bottom here, you find that the highest values were consistently with the flail, and then intermediate values with the roll conditioner, and with no conditioning, you had less losses. And of course, the higher the dry matter, the greater the losses in general. So you want to use your flail for grasses, you want to use the roll for alfalfa and other legumes, because what you're losing there is leaf losses, which means you are losing protein, you're losing digestibility, which are critical for performance of the animals. So how about losses during the fermentation? In this case, your chop length is very important. If you don't have a good chop length, then ability to pack the forage properly is going to be reduced. So chopping properly, checking the blades and knives and the roll clearance and setting them before you start cutting, and then several times during the day is very important to minimize those losses and increase your packing density. Inoculants can also help. Now, we have to be careful because these are the homolactic, the traditional type of inoculants like Lactobacillus plantarum, Pediococcus pentosarsius. These types are very important. They increase the rate of acidification, the pH reduction, and they reduce dry matter losses. So this is a meta-analysis we did some years ago with 51 studies, and you could see that we had almost a 10% decrease in losses by using the inoculants. So using the right type of inoculants, of course, at the right application rate, at least 10 to the 5 CFUs per gram, can be effective in reducing the losses. And in that same study, we found that when inoculants were applied at least 10 to the 5 CFU per gram, they did increase milk production. So that's also something to bear in mind. You're not just reducing dry matter losses, but also increasing performance. So it's really a win-win. Now, when we think about dry matter losses in relation to packing density and dry matter content, this graph here tries to illustrate how the relationship looks or what it looks like. So as your dry matter increases, your dry matter losses, as your dry matter decreases, your dry matter losses increase. And as your dry matter density increases, your dry matter loss decreases. And I'm going to illustrate that further with this picture and another graph. So if we just look at this picture for a minute and tell me what you think is wrong with it. Well, maybe you can't tell me because I'm not on Facebook. Well, first of all, you might look at this and say, well, yeah, this guy here, the smallest tractor, the lightest tractor is doing the edge, the walls and the side area, and that is right. That's a problem. The heaviest tractor should be used, especially around the sidewall area. But in addition to that, he's actually spraying his inoculant. You can see the inoculant tank, and if you look carefully, you can see he's spraying the inoculant from that tractor. And this is one of the wrong and worst ways to apply inoculant. Inoculant should be applied in the field from the chopper so that you get a uniform application. So it's important to increase pack density by increasing tractor weight, packing time, and then safely increasing the pile height. But we have to be careful with our silage delivery rate, because if you are delivering too quickly, then the temptation is to spread it very thinly and just to continue trying to keep up with the semis delivering the silage. And that's a challenge. That's a challenge for dry matter density, and we need to try and avoid that. When we're packing, sometimes we also spend a long day working. The bunker is about full, and want to just finish and go back home and relax for the evening. But it's very important to do a good job with those last few layers, because that's what forms the top layer. And that top layer is the area that receives the most oxygen, which is why it is most susceptible to losses. So this is some work we did some years ago where we buried bags in the top foot below the surface or the bottom 5 feet. And you can see that the dry matter losses were much greater, almost double at the top than at the bottom. And then the fermentation was worse, and heating was also worse from the top layer. So the extra time and effort you pay in packing that top layer well will really pay dividends in the end. So when you're packing, you want to aim for a bulk density of 45 pounds per cubic foot, or a dry matter density of about 15 pounds per cubic foot. And again, measuring the density is important. So using a corer, if you can do it safely and you won't have an avalanche, that's fine. Silage safety is so important. We've lost a lot of good people to avalanches. So a block cutter is a better way to go. Using spreadsheets like the one created by University of Wisconsin to estimate the density from things like your how much you put in and the dimensions of your silo and so on are also important. There are also online real-time density measuring devices that can be used to measure the density. But the key point, whichever one you use, is to monitor that density and make sure that you are achieving these targets. Now, in this graph, I want to try and show what happens when you delay sealing, because sometimes we feel that, well, it's been a long day and we're not going to bother with sealing. So this is a study which was done in which they looked at prompt versus a 2-day delay versus a 4-day delay, and they looked at a high density versus a low density system. And what they found was that a 2-day delay increased the level of dry matter losses a little bit, and that was more evident in the poorly packed low density forage. But a 4-day delay resulted in a very big increase in dry matter losses. And then when we looked at the heating, the aerobic stability, there was a progressive, like a linear decrease in heating as the delay progressed and increased. And of course, those values, the heating, the aerobic stability was less for the lower density silage. So prompt sealing of the silo is important, and packing it well is also very important. Okay, sealing, how well are the side walls covered? This is really critical because we're trying to contain and prevent entry of oxygen. So contain the silage mass, prevent entry of oxygen. So ensuring that overlapping plastic sheets overlap by at least 1 meter. Same thing for the areas where the plastic overlaps on the ground, and making sure that rain cannot get into the plastic or into the silage, weighting down properly, sealing holes properly. So these seem like simple points, but they are very, very important to minimizing losses. Same thing is weighting. So, when we look at this, the tires here, the touching tires, it's a lot of work. But, there are studies showing that tire density negatively correlated with top layer temperature and indigestible protein. So that blackening of the top layer can be reduced if you use sufficient tires to weight down the plastic. And that weighting down is really important, as I mentioned before, at the overlapping edges and at the areas where the plastic trails on the ground. The type of plastic is also important. And so these are some of the studies done in the early days of, in this particular case, the SiloStop product. And Rich Mock was saying that there was virtual elimination of visible spoilage. Particularly, the difference was really glaring at the shoulders, the sidewall areas. And we have found the same thing here in Florida. Then also, Liming Kong showed a big increase in NDF digestibility areas in the silage mass close to the wall when the SiloStop plastic was used relative to the control. So why do you have these differences? Well, SiloStop is one product, but there are many others. But any of these good oxygen barrier plastics, what they do is they reduce the rate of oxygen transfer into the silage mass. And so here you have the oxygen transfer rate for standard black and white 5 mil plastic. And you can see that the value, the amount of oxygen that penetrates that plastic is a small fraction for the oxygen barrier plastic, even though the thickness is only 1.8 mils. So very, very big difference in oxygen permeability. And here we have a meta-analysis which was done, and they looked at 51 different comparisons of plastic film effects. And what they found was if you were looking at the bunker layer, bunker silage top layer dry matter losses, significantly less with the oxygen barrier plastic. Baled silage, significantly less dry matter losses. The amount of inedible silage, which would be thrown away, was about a third. And then the aerobic stability was almost double when the plastic, the oxygen barrier plastic was used. So really, really convincing results here that show that this oxygen, the type of plastic you use really matters for cutting down your dry matter losses and the heating. And Keith Bolson has done research that I'm sure many of you have seen showing the cost effectiveness for these plastic sheets. Okay, what about preventing losses at feed out or on the silo phase? So the heating in silage is caused by yeasts. And then once the yeast increase the pH by using up lactic acid, moles start to proliferate. And yeast and moles contribute to dry matter losses. And so in this graph here on the top here, this is several different studies represented by the different shapes here. And what you find is that as you increase the mold count of the silage, dry matter losses increase substantially. And note that once you get about 5 logs of CFU per gram, then you have this very much more steep increase in dry matter losses. So it's important to keep the mold counts down. And this graph at the bottom is also showing that with those higher mold counts, the performance of the cows can be reduced. Milk production can also be reduced. So whatever can be done to inhibit the growth of molds or yeasts is important for reducing losses. So prop acid is one of the most effective agents that we can add to silage at ensiling for reducing losses. So if you apply it at 0.1 to 0.3%, can be very effective. So here you see that almost 80% of studies that have used this have shown an improvement in aerobic stability as a result of applying prop acid. And of course, we want to use the buffered product so that we're not causing the hazards and the harm and the damage that the corrosive acids would do. So prop acid is very effective. Of course, the cost is always an issue to consider. Inoculants. Now, this is a different type of inoculant from the one I mentioned before. These would be the back-end inoculants. Most of them would contain Buchneri. Nowadays, some of them contain Delgardi bacteria. And in this case, we had 100 studies, and we found that for hymostrigane, for alfalfa, excuse my spelling there, temperate grasses or school season grasses, corn silage, for all of those, there was an increase in aerobic stability. So this is the reduction in heating and spoilage when these inoculants are used. For the tropical grasses we have here in Florida, the increase was not significant. So it's a challenge for us. With some of these heterolactic inoculants, you can have an increase in dry matter because of the fermentation pathway. But it's usually a very small increase, maybe about 3%, and the benefits of the improved aerobic stability typically outweigh the problem of the small dry matter losses that you can get. This is another study we did where we looked at one of the Buchneri inoculants. This was a combo with Pediococcus pentosaceus, and we saw almost a halving of how much spoiled silage we had to get rid of in 45-ton bags. So these inoculants can really be helpful at reducing losses in our silages. Okay, the feed out rate is how much silage you feed on a daily basis. And it's important to move through that phase as quickly as possible. In this graph here, this is by our colleagues, Boriani and so on from Italy. And what they did is they have these different graphs show different packing densities of silage. And this line here is a 3% dry matter loss during the feed out stage. So that's like a minimum recommended loss, which I want to keep the losses to 3% or less. So if you use a very high packing density down here, and this case was 961 kilograms per cubic meter, you can achieve that by a feed out rate of 0.3 or so meters per week. But hardly any of us ever achieve that kind of high packing density. Most of us are here at about the 700 or the 15 pounds of dry matter per cubic foot, excuse me. And so for most of us, we need to get a packing density of about 1.1 meter a week in the winter or 1.7 meters a week in the summer. And in fact, I have seen in some of my travels, I have seen corn silage that has been put up with no inoculants, and the face is clean, no mold whatsoever, just because of a really high packing density of over 2 meters a week. So, all these different components of the silage making process, all these different steps are important and can contribute to minimizing the losses. The silo face exposure is also an important aspect because the more exposed the face is, the greater the chance for oxygen to get into the silage mass. So wherever possible, keeping that face covered is important. And then the more jagged that face is, the greater the surface area. So again, the more opportunity you have for oxygen penetration. So using a rake or block cutter to harvest the silage and then feed out is much more effective because it keeps a straight face and you have a lower surface area and there's less opportunity for oxygen penetration. So that silage face management is also critical. And the last point I want to make is also sizing of the silo. And just if you look at this, you see how much of the face is exposed. You see this whole mass of silage in the front here, which has not been fed out. You see the whole side is open. So always remember that narrower is better because you want to maximize that feed out rate. So whether it's a bag or a pile or a bunker, the more you can minimize the exposed surface, the more you are minimizing heating, spoilage, and dry matter losses. So avoiding large exposed faces is always important. So I'm going to finish by saying that dry matter losses reflect wasted silage, lost nutrients, energy, and wasted dollars. Those losses can occur and do occur at every stage, right from harvest until you feed the cows. Even in the feed bunk, you can have losses. So it's important to do whatever we can. My last point there is that you take a holistic approach. And what I mean is that we're not just saying we'll use an inoculant or we'll use a rake for face management. We're not just doing that, but we're really taking a whole inventory and calling all the farm staff together and making them understand that at each of the stages, there can be a significant loss. And also the last point, or the second to the last point there, is monitoring, measuring the losses so that you can say how much losses you're having and you can aim and develop a strategy to reduce those losses. So with that, I'll thank you for your attention and I will be glad to take any questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Adesogan. We do have a couple questions popping up on the chat. If anybody would like to add any questions, we do have a few minutes here for discussion. So feel free to hop on and present any questions there. Can you start, when you presented that data with the prompt sealing versus 2-day versus 4-day, it looked like under prompt sealing that there was a higher dry matter loss for the high density versus the low density. Can you clarify maybe why that would have been observed?
Yeah, let me go back to this is the one you're talking about here. So I need to go back and look at that. I meant to do that before I presented this, but I don't believe this difference was significant. I can go back and I can share that information with Barry and Gail, but actually while we're talking, I can maybe, somebody's asking another question. I may be able to find it and look it up.
I guess that's the nice thing about being able to speak from your computer.
Yes. Let's see. But you can go ahead with another question while I look it up.
Sure. We have one question asking about inoculants. Can you talk about some of the characteristics of a good inoculant when making that choice?
Yes, absolutely. So I think there are several characteristics you need to think about when you're choosing an inoculant. The first thing is how are there studies demonstrating the efficacy of inoculant? So it's important to choose a proven inoculant, one in which the studies show that there have been beneficial effects. Second thing is to try and remember that there are two main types of inoculants. There are those that improve the front end. They add the homolactic bacteria that reduce the pH very quickly and reduce dry matter losses. And then there are those that increase aerobic stability. And so it's important to, those are the Buchneri or the Hilgardia type inoculants. So it's important to try and understand the difference. And then having, number one, sufficient numbers of bacteria is very important. So 10 to the 5 is usually the minimum number of bacteria you need to have efficacy. Several of our studies have looked at numbers like 10 to the 4 and found inadequate effects. We don't find the same effects when you reduce that rate. Of course, if you go up to 10 to the 6, those high doses are even more effective, but they are often not economical. So 10 to the 5 is the target for the most part. The other issue is what are the specific bacteria? So for the front end inoculant, you want things like Lactobacillus plantarum, you want things like Pediococcus pendusaceus, and then for the back end inoculants, you want things like Lactobacillus buchneri. But like I said before, trying to make sure that that inoculant is a proven one, that there are a number of independent studies that show the efficacy, that's very important. And then also, once you have the inoculant product, how you apply it is very important. So applying it on the field, like I mentioned, and making sure that we don't leave the inoculants actually lying on the, in our exposed to the sunlight for several hours, because that can inhibit the growth of the bacteria. So those are some important points to consider.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. While we're talking about technologies, especially with the way the dairy market's looking right now, we need to be investing in technologies with a high return on investment, right? So out of some of the different practices and technologies that you've talked about, what would you recommend having the highest return on investment, particularly maybe in farms that have a more minimal approach, drive over piles, for example?
Yeah, I think some of the most important ones would be, first of all, harvesting at the right dry matter. And if you're field curing, using wide swathing, density is almost, it's almost the most important overall. Just achieving that really tight pack is really critical, especially for a pile. So density is very important. If where you said minimal, more minimalist approach. So I don't know if they would be willing to consider plastic, investing in the oxygen barrier plastic, but if not, ensuring a proper seal and using either, even if you can't have full tires, the tire side walls, touching tires, and then the silo face management, those would all be important aspects. And for a pile, rather than having a very wide pile, a narrow, long pile is much more important, so you can move through it quickly.
Mm-hmm. We have a question here about alfalfa. Does alfalfa dry faster if it's not conditioned?
No, I don't believe it dries faster if it's not conditioned. I think conditioning will increase the rate of wilting, and so conditioning can be beneficial. The key is to make sure you don't over-condition by using something like flails that will increase dry matter losses as well as protein losses.
All right. Were you able to?
Okay. Sorry, I did check the study from Italy on the dry matter loss that I showed for the prompt seal, and they're not significantly different.
All right. Thank you for looking that up. We have a question about tower silos. So in the continental US, maybe not as common as they used to be. I know in other parts of the world, they still are. Do you have recommendations for tower silos?
Yeah, the advantage with the tower silos would be that the gravity, the weight of gravity increases the packing density. And so that's a big factor and a big benefit. But some of those other factors we consider. So while your losses as a result of packing may be less if in a tower silo relative to a bunker silo, some of the other aspects that we talked about, so minimizing losses during wilting, thinking about the unloading rate and so on and so forth would be important for a tower silo. Thinking about whether or not, how fast you wilt, all those would be important considerations for a tower silo.
Thank you. All right. I'm not seeing any new questions popping up. And we do have a couple minutes here maybe to stretch and get our next speaker up and ready. So Dr. Adesogan, I thank you again for taking the time to speak with us this morning. Really good talk. So thank you.
Thank you all, and stay safe.